What happens when an empire sends a massive host of its finest soldiers, armored knights, professional crossbowmen, the full weight of medieval military supremacy, to crush a rebellion of mountain farmers? In most cases, history answers that question with a massacre and a footnote. But on the morning of November 15th, 1315, in a narrow pass beside a cold Alpine lake, history answered differently. 1,500 Swiss free men, armed with early halberds, axes, and stones, did something that rewrote the rules of medieval warfare. They didn't just survive. They annihilated one of the largest armies the Habsburg dynasty had ever assembled, and they did it in less than an hour. This is the true story of the Battle of Morgarten. Not a legend, not an exaggeration. A tactical masterpiece executed by men who had never seen a military academy, but who understood something their enemies had forgotten. In the mountains, armor is a coffin, and arrogance is a death sentence. To understand Morgarten, you first have to understand what the Swiss were fighting for and what the Habsburgs believed they were owed. By the early 14th century, the Habsburg family had grown from regional Austrian nobles into one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. Their power came from the feudal system, a rigid hierarchy where serfs worked, nobles ruled, and everyone knew their place. The problem was that the Alpine communities around Lake Lucerne, Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, didn't fit this mold. These weren't starving serfs. They were a wealthy, rural elite. They were free peasants who owned their own cattle, held their own land, and had governed themselves through local assemblies for generations. They answered to the Holy Roman Emperor directly, bypassing the local nobility entirely. According to legend, representatives from these three communities met in a meadow called the Rutli to swear a mutual defense pact. While the Rutli oath is steeped in folklore, history has left us the physical proof of their defiance, the Federal Charter of 1291. Its language was simple. If any outside power tried to impose a lord upon them or strip away their ancient rights, they would fight together. The Habsburgs saw this differently. To Duke Leopold I of Austria, these weren't free citizens defending ancient liberties. They were tax-evading subjects who needed to be reminded of the natural order. When the men of Schwyz raided the Habsburg-allied monastery at Einsiedeln in 1314, Leopold had his justification. He didn't plan a negotiation. He planned an annihilation. The army Duke Leopold, assembled in the autumn of 1315, was designed to project overwhelming force. Later, chroniclers would claim he brought 9,000 men, likely an exaggeration to make the Swiss victory seem more miraculous. Modern historians estimate the force was closer to 3,000 to 5,000 men, but the core of that force was terrifyingly real. It included roughly 2,000 professional fighting men, centered around a devastating wedge of heavy cavalry. These knights represented the pinnacle of medieval military technology. A fully armored knight in the early 14th century wore a hauberk of chainmail, reinforced with early plate armor. The combined weight of rider, armor, weapons, and barding could exceed 500 pounds. In open battle, on flat ground, a charge of heavy cavalry was nearly unstoppable. The psychological impact alone, the thunder of hooves, the wall of steel, could break infantry formations before contact was even made. This was how medieval warfare was supposed to work. Commoners fled, professional soldiers earned their pay, and nobles collected their ransoms. Leopold also brought crossbowmen, infantry, and a substantial baggage train. According to the chronicle known as the Chronicon Moguntinum, the Duke was so confident of victory that he brought ropes for hanging rebel leaders and administrative officials to begin reorganizing the conquered territories immediately. The army marched south from Zug in mid-November, taking a route that would bring them through the narrow pass between the Morgarten Ridge and the Ägeri Sea, Lake Ägeri. Leopold knew this route was constricted. What he didn't know was that the Swiss had been watching his preparations for weeks. The Swiss didn't have knights. They didn't have cavalry. What they had was geography and the intelligence to use it. According to tradition, the Swiss commanders, led by land-holding magistrates like Werner Stauffacher, recognized that they could never defeat the Habsburg army in open battle. Their only chance was to neutralize the Austrian advantages of armor and cavalry by forcing the engagement onto terrain that transformed those advantages into liabilities. The pass at Morgarten was ideal. On one side rose the steep, forested slopes of the Morgarten Ridge. On the other side lay Lake Ägeri, its November waters cold enough to kill an unarmored man in minutes. Between them ran a narrow path, in some places only wide enough for a few men to walk abreast. The ground was uneven, broken by roots and stones, and softened by autumn rain into treacherous mud. For a column of heavy cavalry, this was a nightmare. Horses couldn't charge. Knights couldn't form ranks. The tight spacing meant that if the front of the column stopped suddenly, the rear would compress into it like an accordion. The Swiss positioned themselves above the trail, hidden in the trees on the ridge. Estimates placed their numbers around 1,500. They were woodsmen, herdsmen, and farmers. Men physically conditioned by the harsh Alpine environment. They carried heavy wooden clubs and early versions of the halberd, a polearm fitted with a cleaver-like blade and a hook, and they had gathered boulders, logs, and stones, positioning them at the top of the slope. Then they waited. The Habsburg column entered the pass on the morning of November 15th, 1315. The exact sequence of events is difficult to reconstruct, but sources agree on the essential elements. The Swiss allowed the vanguard of the Austrian army to advance deep into the defile before launching their attack. It began with the rocks. The Swiss rolled boulders and logs down the steep slopes into the packed column below. The physics were devastating. A boulder the size of a man's torso, accelerating down a 40-degree slope, struck with the force of a battering ram. Horses screamed and fell. Knights were knocked from their saddles. The narrow trail instantly became a chaos of fallen men, panicked animals, and shattered equipment. Then the Swiss charged down the slope. Their weapons were purpose, built for this kind of brutal, close-to-quarters slaughter. The heavy blades could shear through the leather straps, holding armor in place, or sever a horse's leg. The hooks could drag a mounted knight from his saddle to the ground, where the weight of his own armor became a prison. And, critically, the Swiss had traction. They knew this ground. According to some accounts, the Swiss had fitted their boots with iron crampons, spikes usually used for climbing on ice. They could sprint and brace on the slick slope. The Austrian knights, by contrast, were wearing steel, soled boots designed for stirrups, sliding helplessly on the wet roots and loose stones. According to the Chronicon Helveticum, the Austrian column collapsed almost immediately. Knights who tried to fight found they could not swing their swords in the press of bodies. Knights who tried to flee found the path blocked by their own comrades, pushing forward from behind. Many were driven into Lake Ägeri. The weight of their mail pulled them under within seconds. The chronicle accounts describe the battle lasting only a short time. Some sources say less than an hour. Others suggest the main slaughter was over in 15 minutes. While the 9,000 figure is a myth, the devastation was real. Roughly 1,500 to 2,000 Habsburg soldiers, the flower of Austrian chivalry, were killed. Swiss losses were minimal. Perhaps barely a dozen men. Duke Leopold survived. He escaped with a small bodyguard, reportedly on foot after his horse was killed beneath him. But his army was destroyed. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who appreciates history that goes deeper than the textbook version. That's exactly what this channel is about: the real tactics, the real stakes, the real people behind the battles that shaped our world. If you want more stories like this, take a second to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's free. It helps the channel grow, and it means you won't miss the next one. Now, let's talk about what made this victory so extraordinary. Military historians have studied Morgarten for centuries, not because of its scale — it was a relatively small engagement — but because of what it revealed about the vulnerabilities of feudal heavy cavalry. The Swiss understood several principles that the Austrians had forgotten. First, terrain nullifies technology. A knight in full armor was the medieval equivalent of a tank, but tanks are useless in swamps, and knights were useless in narrow mountain passes. The Swiss chose their ground specifically to eliminate the Austrian advantages of mobility, shock, and protection. Second, initiative defeats reaction. The Austrians were responding to the terrain as they encountered it. The Swiss had studied the terrain for weeks. They knew exactly where the path narrowed and where the footing was worst. They weren't reacting to the battle. They had designed it. Third, the halberd, even in its early form, was a class-leveling weapon. It took years to train an effective knight. It took weeks to train a man to use a polearm in formation. The hook negated horsemanship. The axe negated armor. For the first time, a commoner with a few months of drilling could kill a noble with a lifetime of martial training, and do it reliably. This was the real revolution of Morgarten. Not just a victory, but a proof of concept. Heavy cavalry could be defeated by disciplined infantry on the right ground. The Habsburgs did not accept their defeat gracefully. Over the following decades, they launched multiple campaigns to reassert control. In 1315, just weeks after Morgarten, the three forest cantons renewed their alliance with the Pact of Brunnen. Other communities, inspired by the victory, began to join the Confederation. In 1339, at the Battle of Alpine, a Swiss force again defeated a larger feudal army. In 1386, at the Battle of Sempach, Swiss infantry decimated the Austrian ranks, killing Duke Leopold III, the grandson of Leopold who had fled Morgarten. At Sempach, the halberd was again the primary weapon, proving that Morgarten was no fluke. By the end of the 14th century, the Swiss Confederation had established itself as a military power that no one wanted to fight. The same peasants who had been dismissed as mountain rats became the most feared infantry in Europe. Within 2 centuries, Swiss mercenaries were guarding the Pope, and Swiss neutrality was a foundational principle of European diplomacy. None of that would have happened without Morgarten. If this story resonated with you, if you found yourself thinking about the tactics, the stakes, what it must have felt like to stand on that ridge with a halberd in your hands, share this video with someone who loves history. The algorithm rewards engagement, and every like, every share, every comment helps this channel reach people who care about these stories as much as you do. History should be told like this, not as a list of dates, but as a record of human courage and human folly. Today, you can visit the site of the Battle of Morgarten. The pass is quieter now. There's a chapel built in the 17th century to commemorate the fallen on both sides. The lake still lies cold and grey beneath the ridge. The slopes are still steep, still forested, still the kind of ground where a man on foot moves faster than a man on horseback. Every year, on November 15th, the people of Schwyz hold a commemoration. They remember the men who stood on this ridge 7 centuries ago and refused to kneel. The Habsburgs had numbers. They had armor. They had the full legitimacy of feudal order. The Swiss had a lake, a slope, and a reason to fight. It was enough. And in the chronicle of military history, Morgarten stands as a reminder that the most dangerous enemy is not the one with the most gold or the heaviest armor. It's the one who knows the ground, chooses the moment, and has nothing left to lose.